Daniel chapter 3, probably one of the most familiar Bible stories in the entire Bible. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time trying to review every element of the story, but in the handout that I prepared for this, I had kind of devoted the first paragraph on the first page to a lengthy attempt at trying to get us to think a little bit outside the box. And then this morning I realized I could approach this with a lot less verbiage than what I did on that sheet. And the real question before the three young men in Daniel chapter 3, and by the way, on the third page there, I have a little thing about their names, okay? I don't know if we had covered this before back in chapter 1. But the Hebrew names for the three young men are Hananiah, which possibly means Jehovah is gracious, or Jehovah has been gracious. Mishael, who is he that is God, or who is what God is. And Azariah, the Lord helps, or Jehovah has helped. When they're taken to Babylon, they are assigned Chaldean names. And those are the names that we probably are most familiar with: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay, Shadrach, it's a little bit more difficult to try to determine what the meanings of these Babylonian or Chaldean names were. But each of those names is probably referencing a Babylonian god. So Shadrach, probably command of Aku. Meshach, who is what Aku or God is. Aku is the Babylonian moon god. And Abednego, servant of Nebo, the son of the Babylonian deity Bel. These new names are obviously intended to aid in divorcing these young men from their Jewish heritage and their religion, and are intended to help from the Babylonian viewpoint or Nebuchadnezzar's viewpoint to convert them over to the Babylonian way of life, religion, politics, and everything else. All right, so anyhow, these three young men, and when they were taken captive, we think probably in 605 BC, they're probably no more than teenagers. And the timing of chapter 3 is kind of debatable. I have something about that on the back page as well. The Septuagint has an explanation that's added to it. This is on page 3, kind of the middle of the page. Is a short paragraph about it. When did the event occur? The Septuagint adds that this occurred in Nebuchadnezzar's 18th year, which would place it in 587, which would be 1 year before the fall and destruction, or the final destruction of Jerusalem in 586. If that's the case, these are no longer teenagers. They are young adult men, possibly even with families at this point. But there's nothing that really ties that down from the biblical text. And so there's a lot of conservative commentators who think that this is actually occurring much earlier in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And what Nebuchadnezzar is doing here in this chapter is, I think, best understood as an intent, is intended to consolidate his position as successor to his father, consolidate his power in the expanding Babylonian Empire. And so this is as much a political event as it is religious. I think if you're familiar with the story, you tend to grow up thinking this is all about religion, okay? But there's this very strong political element here. And so that in itself helps me understand a little bit better then that part of the issue with whether or not to bow down to this image that all of the officials are supposed to do, that the issue here is really one of compromise. At this time in Middle Eastern history, you have all these different city-states, civilizations. Each group has their own deity or a group of deities that they worship. And as the Babylonian Empire is expanding under Nabopolassar, who's the father of Nebuchadnezzar, and then under Nebuchadnezzar, all right, these different Middle Eastern groups are being incorporated into that empire, and they have their own politics, they have their own religion, and part of the task then of maintaining an empire like that is developing cohesiveness to that, okay? And so I really think that what Nebuchadnezzar is trying to accomplish here is to solidify the politics of this empire. And in doing so, he erects this image. We don't even know what the image looks like, okay? Since it's made out of gold, it's easy to see that perhaps Nebuchadnezzar is associating this image with what Daniel had described to him in that previous vision, where Daniel tells King Nebuchadnezzar, "You are that head of gold," okay? So there's possibility that the image is of Nebuchadnezzar himself. It could be an image of one of the main deities, Babylonian deities, such as Marduk or Bel. It could be even not an image of a human or a godly type of form. It could be like the Egyptians. There's some different obelisks or steles that were erected that recorded events, their campaigns, their military successes, and things like that. It could be something like that. We just don't know. But whatever it is, to me it would make the most sense that it either represents a deity or represents Nebuchadnezzar, because he wants everybody to bow down, prostrate themselves before this image and worship it. All right? That worshiping is really an acknowledgement of the authority and the position that Nebuchadnezzar has. And so the question is, as these different kingdoms are brought into the Babylonian kingdom, those people they're allowed to maintain their own deities and still worship their own deities. But on this day, all of these officials from all around the empire are brought in, okay? And they're all instructed to bow down and worship this image that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. As far as Nebuchadnezzar is concerned, and as far as we understand how this empire worked, once this was over, they could go home and still worship their own deities, okay? They didn't have to deny their deities. They just had to incorporate into what they were doing here what Nebuchadnezzar commanded as well, all right? So from their viewpoint, I think they see this basically a political thing, and hey, Nebuchadnezzar, he conquered us. His gods must be better than our gods, okay? We can still have our gods, but let's pay due homage to Nebuchadnezzar's deities as well, all right? Most of them apparently have no problem with making this compromise, and that's the key word here, compromise, right? Not Daniel, but the three boys, the three young men, they make a choice here to not compromise. And when it comes to application from this chapter here, I think the question to ask ourselves is, what, if any, compromise are we making with the world system, right? And that could be talked about, I guess, in a number of different ways. But for each one of us, this is probably a very personal thing to ask yourself. Are you making compromises for the sake of the politics? Are you making compromises for the sake of other religions? Are you making compromises for the sake of the cultural aspects, the various isms that we are taught as we're being educated in our society? Are you, in a sense, bowing yourself before those and making compromise in order to make it comfortable for yourself? Well, these young men make a very difficult choice. They're not going to compromise because in their minds and what they've been taught, okay, they've been divorced maybe for a number of years, or not divorced, but taken away from their parents, taken away from that Jewish culture, and yet they've retained what they were taught. And what they were taught was that God is one. There is one God, and there is only one God, and there are no other gods. And so in view of that, they cannot make a compromise without, in a sense, defaming the very God they claim to worship. So the amazing thing here is that they have the character to stand before the very man who holds their lives in his hand and simply say to him, "We will not bow down, we will not worship your image." That is a courageous act of faith. It really is. And again, the question we can ask ourselves, if we are put in a similar position, would we be that courageous?
I think,
Jay.
yeah, I was just going to mention, you look through the history of all the martyrs. I don't know that sitting here today we could say, boy, I know I'll have that strength, but I think we get the strength from the Holy Spirit when we need the strength, right?
Yes.
And the best thing we can do in the meantime is this: worship God and fellowship.
Yeah.
Right? That's how we prepare.
Keep that relationship. You've got to keep that relationship going. There's a book out there, you can still get it, called Fox's Book of Martyrs. And there's amazing tales. I shouldn't say tales. They're amazing historical accounts of people who have not compromised their faith. And again, I like the phrase courageous faith. And when the time comes, I think you're right, Jay. I think God, the Holy Spirit, provides the strength, the courage to face that time. And you may look at yourself and think, I couldn't do that. But God can provide. Just a few other observations about this passage here. In fact, anybody else want to make any other comment here?
Well, I've thought
Marianne?
a lot of times over the last few years, when Iris and Rob were in Afghanistan, and maybe they were Iraq, I forget for sure, but anyway, a lot of those people came to know the Lord through visions and whatnot. And right up to the end, they had to stand firm. And I don't know, it just hit my heart at the time. If I was under the same conditions, would I be able to stand firm like they do?
Yeah.
I think they are to be held up as examples.
Okay, if you couldn't hear what Marianne was saying, she's referencing Iris and Rob Antonucci and their time in Afghanistan. And of course, we know politically and militarily how that played out and the difficulties that they encountered there, particularly toward the end, and the stand in the faith that they had to take and the risk of putting their lives on the line. Okay, and again, that leads us to look to people like that for example, and at the same time to question ourselves, to ask ourselves, okay, am I ready for that? And I think all of us wonder as we look at what's happening in the nation and the world around us, is that time rapidly approaching where we're going to have to make these kind of choices? And some of you maybe are already having to make choices like this. And good grief in the workplace. Some of the businesses that you can be working for these days are already requiring employees to go to what we'll call sensitivity trainings about different issues, right? um, things like that. And if you don't cooperate, there's a possibility of losing your job. How are you going to handle that? Well, the three young men, to them, the choice is clear. So Nebuchadnezzar, he makes this image, he sets it up. Where was this image? It doesn't exist anymore. It was described in the Hebrew as 60 cubits tall and 6 cubits wide, which is a very elongated for a human type of form. Judy, did you have a comment there?
Well, I just had a question about, do you know how many people, like with Daniel, were transported there that didn't stand? I mean, a lot of the Jewish kids went ahead and went along with whatever they were doing. Do we have any numbers anywhere?
No, not. I don't know of any numbers that would give us an answer like that. We do know when they returned from captivity at the end of the 70-year period, we have a very complete list of who all returned, and there were two main waves of exiles that came back to Judea and Jerusalem. And when you look at those numbers, it's quite evident that many more stayed behind, stayed in Babylon, okay? And so there's a legitimate question there to ask, did they stay there because they became comfortable with the culture and everything? Or did they stay there, or were they still faithful to their faith, to their God, but at the same time they're comfortable in their location, they have businesses established? And yeah, and that's one of the other interesting questions here is why isn't Daniel mentioned in chapter 3? Yeah, and we have no answers for that, okay? I propose two possibilities here that you can find in other sources as well. One is that he was of such a high rank in the kingdom that no one dared to bring an accusation against him, because Daniel himself might have had the authority to have such a person executed. Okay, so that's just a possibility, okay? And the other was that he was absent from this affair, perhaps attending to matters of such importance within the empire in some other location that he was, in a sense, excused by Nebuchadnezzar from being there. Okay, so that's all speculation. We don't have any scriptural answer for it. Okay, I think based on everything else we see in this book, that if Daniel had been there, he would have been right with him, with the other three men. One of the things I find interesting about this entire incident is that you read there, let's see, at verse 5, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, my version says trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, not like the Scottish one, but similar in a sense, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up, okay? What connection, if any, do you see between all of this music and worshiping this image? I'm going to let you think about that for a sec. You see any connection between this? Jay, I see you kind of going, yeah. What do you want to say, Jay?
Except that when we worship, we sing before we, go into the message. That's the only thing I can think of.
Okay. Anybody else?
It may have been a distraction.
A distraction. Okay. Would you care to explain that a little more?
Just to get them not to think about what they're doing, but to think about.
Okay, to be so distracted by the music as to not focus on what they're being required to do, perhaps in a sense to, could we say that the music is being used to compel them into doing this? Charles, is that what you were going to say?
I couldn't help but think of Psalm 150 and how that music was used to bring people together to worship in the temple.
Okay.
And so we do the same thing. We use music bring us into worship and to continue in worship. The music is a part of the worship.
Okay, all right. There's a, well, Jill, another comment?
What came to my mind was get them hyped up. You know, sometimes that happens in some churches.
Yeah, so there's two sides to this, okay? And I think Charles has brought out the positive side. You're bringing out perhaps the negative side. And yes, music can be used. It's a form of communication. It's an inexact form of communication, but it is a form of human communication. And it basically is aimed at what? The emotions, right? Okay? It's aimed at the emotions. And so music can be used to manipulate, okay? And that's exactly what I think is going on here. The music is being used to manipulate them into this act of obedience before the image. So, little side application, be on the lookout for people, groups, concerts, whatever, that are trying to misuse music in that fashion, okay? And even in churches, okay? Music can be misused, okay? Music is a tool, it's a wonderful tool that God has given us. Think of the human voice, that he created us with the ability to sing. And some of you are probably thinking, well, he kind of jumped over me or something. But all of us, I think, when we get to heaven and we're in that resurrected body, I think we're all going to have wonderful voices, okay? And we're all going to be able to sing unto the Lord. Now, think about that. So look out for that. We're basically out of time here. So you got the rest of the notes there. And the men who bring the accusations against the three young men, in one version they're called the astrologers, and another Bible version translation they're called the Chaldeans, all right? These were local officials in Babylon that probably before even Nebuchadnezzar rose to power after his father had died. And I think they're very jealous. I think they're very envious of the fact that Nebuchadnezzar took these three young men and promoted them to such high position. And it's rather ironic how their efforts to accuse and incriminate these young men turns against them, and that the final outcome is that the three young men are promoted even higher within Babylon. Okay, let's close in prayer. Father, thank you again for the time, for the truth of your word, for the example that has been recorded here, that has been preserved for us for over 2,500 years. And yet it conveys a message that is as important to us today as it was to them. We thank you for their testimony. We pray, Lord, that as we stand in continuing relationship with you, that if we face these kind of situations and the opportunity to compromise, that you, your Spirit within us, might strengthen us with that courageous kind of faith to stand against the tide. Even as Sonia has talked about the chosen here, and in that series they show all of these fish swimming one direction, but there's two fish that are swimming against the current, against all of that. As Christians, that's what we have the opportunity to be.